This is the inaugural episode of Dillon's Radio Theater Children's Tales series, a series devoted to both folk and authored stories meant to be told or read to children. In this episode, our inaugural episode, we'll be comparing Little Red Riding Hood as it appeared in three different centuries. You'll hear a version from the 17th century France, a version from early 19th century Germany, and a version shaped by late 19th century America, so from the early 20th century. Each tells the same basic story, but they do not mean the same thing. The changes are purposeful, for they were used to raise children differently. They reflect changing ideas about childhood, danger, and morality. We all tend to think the stories we were told as children are constant and never changing. That is far from the truth. They are reshaped to suit the anxieties and values of the moment. As you listen, consider not just the story being told, but the audience it was meant for and the world that it came from. The first, Little Red Riding Hood by Charles Perrault in 1697, France. Once upon a time there was a little village girl, the prettiest creature who was ever seen. Her mother was extremely fond of her, and her grandmother loved her still more. This good woman had made for her a little Red Riding Hood, which suited her so well that she was called by everyone Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Go, my dear, and see how your grandmother is doing, for I hear she has been very ill. Take her this cake and this little pot of butter." Little Red Riding Hood set out immediately to go to her grandmother, who lived in another village. As she was going through the wood, she met a wolf. The wolf had a very great mind to eat her up, but he dared not because of some woodcutters working nearby in the forest. He asked her where she was going. The poor child, who did not know that it was dangerous to stay and talk with the wolf, said to him, "I am going to see my grandmother and carry her a cake and a little pot of butter from my mother." "Does she live far off?" said the wolf. "Oh, yes," Little Red Riding Hood replied. "It is beyond that mill you see there, at the first house in the village." "Well," said the wolf, "and I will go and see her too. I'll take this path, and you will take that one, and we will see who will get there first." The wolf immediately ran to the grandmother's house, took the shortest path, while the little girl took the longer one, amusing herself by gathering nuts, running after butterflies, and making nosegays of the little flowers she found. It was not long before the wolf arrived at the old woman's house. He knocked on the door. "Who is there?" asked the grandmother. "It is your child, Little Red Riding Hood," replied the wolf, counterfeiting her voice. "I have brought you a cake and a little pot of butter from my mother." The good grandmother, who was in bed because she was ill, cried out, "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up." The wolf pulled the bobbin and the door opened. He fell upon the good woman and ate her up in a moment, for it had been more than 3 days since he had eaten. He then shut the door and got into the grandmother's bed, waiting for Little Red Riding Hood, who came some time afterward and knocked at the door. "Who is there?" she asked. Little Red Riding Hood, hearing the wolf's rough voice, was at first afraid, but believing her grandmother had a cold and was hoarse, answered, "It is your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood. I have brought you a cake and a little pot of butter from my mother." The wolf cried out to her, softening his voice as much as he could, "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up." Little Red Riding Hood pulled the bobbin and the door opened. The wolf, seeing her come in, said to her, hiding himself under the bedclothes, "Put the cake and the little pot of butter upon the stool and come into bed with me." Little Red Riding Hood took off her clothes and got into bed. She was greatly amazed to see how her grandmother looked in her nightclothes, and said to her, "Grandmother, what big arms you have!" "All the better to hug you with, my dear." "Grandmother, what big legs you have!" "All the better to run with, my child." "Grandmother, what big ears you have!" "All the better to hear you with, my child." "Grandmother, what big eyes you have!" "All the better to see with, my child." "Grandmother, what big teeth you have!" "All the better to eat you with." Saying these words, the wolf The wicked wolf fell upon Little Red Riding Hood and ate her up. And that's how that story ends. The moral. Children, especially young girls, pretty, well-bred, and gentle, should never talk to strangers, for if they should do so, they may well provide dinner for a wolf. I say wolf, but there are various kinds of wolves. There are also those who are charming, quiet, polite, and agreeable, who pursue young women at home and in the streets. And unfortunately, it is these gentle wolves who are the most dangerous of all. Next, Little Red Cap by Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a sweet little girl who was loved by everyone who looked at her, but most of all by her grandmother. And there was nothing that she would not have given the child when she gave her a little cap of red velvet, which suited her so well that she would never wear anything else. So she was always called Little Red Cap. One day her mother said to her, "Come, Little Red Cap, here is a piece of cake and a bottle of wine. Take them to your grandmother. She is ill and weak, and they will do her good. Set out before it grows hot, and when you are going, walk nicely and quiet, and do not run off the path." "I will take great care," said Little Red Cap to her mother, and gave her hand on it. The grandmother lived out in the wood, half a league from the village. As soon as Little Cap entered the wood, a wolf met her. Little Red Cap did not know what a wicked creature he was, and was not at all afraid of him. "Good day, Little Red Cap," said the wolf. "Thank you kindly, wolf. Where are you going so early, Little Red Cap?" "To my grandmother's." "What have you got in your apron?" "Cake and wine. Yes, it was baking day, so poor sick grandmother is to have something good to make her stronger." "Where does your grandmother live, Little Red Cap?" "A good quarter of a league farther down the road. Her house stands under the 3 large oak trees. The nut trees are just below." "You surely must know it," replied Little Red Cap. The wolf thought to himself, "What a tender young creature. What a nice plump mouthful. She'll be better to eat than that old woman. I must act craftily so I can catch both." So he walked for a short time by the side of Little Red Cap, and then said, "See, Little Red Cap, how pretty the flowers are about here. Why don't you not look around? I believe you do not hear how sweetly the birds are singing. You walk gravely along as if you were going to school, while everything else here in the wood is merry." Little Red Cap raised her eyes, and when she saw the sunbeams dancing here and there through the trees, and pretty flowers growing everywhere, she thought, "Suppose I take grandmother a fresh nosegay. That would please her too." So she ran from the path into the wood to gather flowers, and whenever she had picked one, she fancied she saw a prettier one farther on, and ran after it, and so got deeper and deeper into the wood. Meanwhile, the wolf ran straight to the grandmother's house and knocked on the door. "Who's there?" "Little Red Cap," replied the wolf. "She's bringing cake and wine. Open the door." "Lift the latch," called out the grandmother. "I am too weak and cannot get up." The wolf lifted the latch, the door sprang open, and without saying a word, he went straight to the grandmother's bed and devoured her. Then he put on her clothes, dressed himself up in her cap, laid himself in bed, and drew the curtains. Little Red Cap, however, had been running about picking flowers, and when she gathered so many she could carry no more, she remembered her grandmother and set out on her way. She was surprised to find the cottage door standing open, and when she entered the room, she felt something was so strange that she said to herself, "Oh dear, how uneasy I feel today, and other times I like being with grandmother so much." She went to the bed and drew back the curtains. "Grandmother, what big ears you have!" "All the better to hear you with, my child." "Grandmother, what big eyes you have!" "All the better to see you with, my child." "Grandmother, what big hands you have!" "All the better to catch hold of you with." "But grandmother, what big teeth you have!" "All the better to eat you with." And scarcely had the wolf said this, with one bound he was out of bed and swallowed up Little Red Cap. When the wolf had satisfied his appetite, he laid down again in the bed, fell asleep, and began to snore very loudly. Huntsman was just passing by the house and thought, how the old woman snores. I want to see if she wants anything. So he went into the room, and when he came to the bed, he saw that the wolf was lying in it. Do I find you here, you old sinner, said the huntsman. I have long sought you. Then he was just going to shoot him when it occurred to him that the wolf might have devoured the grandmother and she might still be saved. So he did not fire, but took a pair of scissors and began to cut open the wolf's belly. When he made 2 snips, he saw the little red cap shining, and then he made 2 more snips, and the little girl sprang out, crying, "Ah, how frightened I've been! How dark it was inside the wolf!" And after that, the old grandmother came out alive also, but scarcely able to breathe. Little Red Cap, however, quickly fetched some great stones with which they filled the wolf's belly. When he awoke, he wanted to run away, but the stones were so heavy that he collapsed at once and fell dead. Then all 3 were glad. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine that Little Red Cap had brought and revived. Little Red Cap thought to herself, as long as I live, I will never again stray from the path and run into the wood when my mother has forbidden me to do so. Why this version matters. The rescue replaces fatalism. Authority restores order. That's the huntsman. Obedience replaces Perrault's sexual caution. Evil is punished, not merely revealed. This is the moralized, institutionalized tale, and it is the hinge between folklore and children's literature. Little Red Riding Hood, adapted by James Baldwin from Fairy Tales and Fables, 1897. Once there was a little girl who was called Little Red Riding Hood because she wore a little red cloak with a hood that her grandmother had made for her. One morning her mother said, "Little Red Riding Hood, your grandmother is ill. Take her a basket of food and do not stop on the way, nor speak to anyone you do not know." Little Red Riding Hood promised to do exactly as her mother said and started at once through the woods to her grandmother's house. As she was walking along, she met a wolf. "Good morning, Little Red Riding Hood," said the wolf. "Good morning," answered the little girl, for she did not know that wolves were dangerous. "Where are you going?" asked the wolf. "I am going to my grandmother's house," said Little Red Riding Hood. "She is sick, and I'm carrying her something to eat." "And where does your grandmother live?" asked the wolf. "She lives beyond the mill in a little house near the wood," said the child. The wolf thought to himself that he could not eat the little girl and the grandmother too. If he were clever. So he said, "See how beautiful the flowers are? Why do you not gather some for your grandmother? It would please her very much." Little Red Riding Hood thought that was a good idea, and she stepped aside from the path to pick flowers. While she was doing this, the wolf ran as fast as he could to grandmother's house. He knocked at the door. "Who is there?" asked the grandmother. "It is Little Red Riding Hood," said the wolf, speaking softly. "I have brought you something from my mother." "Lift the latch," said the grandmother. "I am too weak to get up." The wolf lifted the latch and went in. In a moment, he had eaten the grandmother, and then he put on her nightcap and lay down in her bed. After a while, Little Red Riding Hood came to the house and knocked. "Come in," said the wolf, trying to speak like the grandmother. Little Red Riding Hood went in and stood by the bed. "Grandmother," she said, "what large ears you have." "All the better to hear you with," said the wolf. "And what large eyes you have." "All the better to see you." "What large teeth you have." "All the better to eat you." Then the wolf sprang out of the bed, swallowing Little Red Riding Hood. Soon afterward, a hunter passed the house. Hearing loud snoring, he went in to see if anything was wrong. When he saw the wolf by the bed, he knew at once what had happened. He could open the wolf's body and out came Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, both alive. They filled the wolf's body with heavy stones, and when he awoke and tried to run away, he fell down dead. Little Red Riding Hood thanked for the hunter and the grandmother and was very glad to be safe again, and Little Red Riding Hood learned to obey her mother and never again to leave the path that she was sent on. Curator's notes: the trajectory of sanitization. The 3 versions you've just heard illustrate not merely variations of the tale, but a clear historical trajectory. In the late 17th century, when Charles Perrault first published Little Red Riding Hood, the story functioned as an adult social warning. Its danger was permanent, its ending final, its moral explicit. The world contains predators who do not look like monsters. By the early 19th century, the Brothers Grimm preserved the story while reshaping it, removing its sexual implications and restoring order through authority. What had been a warning about society became a lesson about obedience. By the late 19th century, as fairy tales entered American school books, the story was further simplified in adaptations such as those by James Baldwin. Tale became more practical and instructional, stripped of ambiguity and framed as a matter of good judgment and bad choices. The wolf is no longer a metaphor for human danger, but simply a hazard to be avoided. The story had become safe enough for classrooms, predictable enough for children, and useful as a moral exercise rather than as a cautionary tale. The most dramatic change, however, came after the Second World War. In the post-World War II period, Western culture redefined childhood as something that must be protected, not only from harm, but from fear itself. Psychological stories, educational standards, and parental expectations increasingly treated disturbance as damage. Fairy tales were rewritten to reassure rather than to warn. Violence was softened, consequences reversed, and darkness removed. Stories that once prepared children for danger were redesigned to promise that danger would always be resolved by others. Mass media accelerated this transformation. Radio, television, illustrated books, and later films required stories that were brief, clear, and comforting. Ambiguity did not translate well, nor did unresolved endings. By the 1950s, Little Red Riding Hood had largely completed its transformation from folklore into content. What was lost in that process was not cruelty, but realism. The original tale did not exist to frighten children. It existed to tell the truth, plainly about the world they would eventually have to enter. The trajectory of sanitization summary. Charles Perrault, 1697. Adult social warning, sexual predation is the subtext. No rescue, death is final. Moral is explicit and unsettling. Brothers Grimm. The violence remains but becomes reversible. Authority hunter restores order. Sexual danger is removed. Obedience replaces social critique. This is moral instruction, not social warning. By late 19th century, American school book tradition, Baldwin, like the one I just read to you, plain language, practical caution, clear do-don't lessons, emotional safety. Language is plain and practical, no verse moral, no symbolism explained. Danger is real but uncomplicated. Lesson is common sense judgment, not seduction or fate. By the 1950s, full sanitization occurred. This is where the real shift happens. Key features introduced or cemented were no implication of sexuality at all. Wolf becomes a cartoon villain. Fear is softened. Violence is brief, clean, and consequence-free. Emphasis on reassurance, not warning. Wolf stops being a metaphor for men and becomes just a naughty animal who will be dealt with. This transformation from folklore to comfort story, that contrast is powerful and maybe a bit unsettling in its own way. Bottom line, by the 1950s, Little Red Riding Hood had been desexualized, de-dangerized, de-adulted, turned into reassurance. I hope you enjoyed this little trip down fairy tale history. Stories presented by Dillon's Radio Theater are offered for educational and entertainment purposes. We present unabridged works for the public domain. Curator notes will often follow to provide background and context. Every effort is made to remain faithful to the source material. The narration and any accompanying commentary reflect the interpretive representation of Dillon's Radio Theater. You just listened to Dillon's Radio Theater, produced and narrated by Craig K. Dillon. For full access to future productions and the curated library, you can subscribe on Patreon. Links are in the description.